August 16, 1988. A summer morning in Germany. The sun was shining, birds were singing. Life was moving at its usual pace. In homes and workplaces, people went about their routines. Children played in parks, their laughter echoing in the summer air. No one knew that this day, this seemingly ordinary day, would soon be etched in Germany's memory. It would become a symbol of chaos, fear, and the horrifying power of desperation. The calm of that Tuesday morning was deceptive. Beneath the surface of normalcy, a storm was brewing. Two men, fueled by desperation and a warped sense of ambition, were about to unleash a maelstrom of violence that would shock the nation. The city of Gladbeck, nestled in the Ruhr region of West Germany, was an unlikely setting for such a dramatic event. It was a place of industry and hard-working people. Life there was generally peaceful, predictable, but on that fateful Tuesday, the mundane was about to collide with the extreme. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the doors of the Deutsche Bank branch on the bustling street of Markstrasse swung open. Employees, their minds on the day's tasks, prepared for another routine day. They had no reason to suspect that two figures lurking nearby were about to change their lives forever. Rosner and Degowski, armed and masked, stormed into the bank. Their eyes were cold, their movements calculated. The quiet hum of the bank was instantly shattered by their shouts. Fear, raw and immediate, gripped the employees and customers inside. They were trapped, their lives hanging precariously in the balance. The robbery itself was over in minutes. Rosner and Degowski, their bags filled with cash, were ready to make their escape. But as they prepared to flee into the anonymity of the city, something unexpected occurred. A police patrol car, responding to a silent alarm, pulled up outside the bank. The robbers' carefully laid plans began to unravel. Their escape route was blocked. They were cornered. Desperation set in. Trapped and with their backs against the wall, Rosner and Degowski made a split-second decision that would transform a bank robbery into a national crisis. They took hostages. The terrified bank employees and customers became pawns in a deadly game. Their lives were now intertwined with the fate of their captors. News of the hostage situation spread like wildfire. Sirens wailed as police cars and emergency vehicles converged on the bank. Crowds began to gather, drawn by the spectacle of the unfolding drama. The media, sensing a sensational story, descended upon Gladbeck. Cameras rolled, microphones were thrust forward, and a nation watched in horror as the standoff played out on their television screens. The police, faced with a volatile and unpredictable situation, were caught off guard. Every minute that ticked by increased the pressure. Negotiators were brought in, their voices calm and measured, as they attempted to establish contact with the hostage takers. The atmosphere was thick with tension, lives hung in the balance, and the world held its breath. What began as a bank robbery had escalated into a full-blown hostage crisis. The criminals, now at the center of a media frenzy, were no longer anonymous thieves. They were desperate men, their faces plastered across newspapers and television screens, their every move scrutinized by a nation on edge. The Gladbeck hostage crisis had begun, and the world watched with bated breath, uncertain of how the tragedy would unfold. Inside the bank, panic reigned. The air hung heavy with fear, the silence punctuated by sobs and muffled cries. Rosner, erratic and unpredictable, barked orders at the hostages, his voice amplified by the cavernous space. Degowski, his hand trembling on the trigger of his pistol, scanned the room, his eyes darting nervously towards the windows. The arrival of the police car had thrown their carefully crafted plan into disarray. Their intended escape route, a labyrinth of narrow streets leading to a waiting getaway car, was now useless. They were trapped, surrounded by the growing presence of law enforcement. Their initial plan had been simple: get in, get the money, get out. Now, their simple robbery had morphed into something far more dangerous. Rosner, his voice tight with desperation, made a demand. A car, a fast car with no tricks. He wanted safe passage out of the city, away from the growing army of police officers surrounding the bank. He wanted freedom, and he was willing to trade the lives of the hostages for it. The police, caught in a delicate dance of negotiation and strategic planning, stalled for time. Every second was precious, every decision fraught with risk. Outside, the world had shrunk to the confines of the bank's facade. News crews, their cameras hungry for images, broadcast the unfolding drama live, their lenses capturing the fear etched on the faces of onlookers and the grim determination of the police officers taking up positions around the building. The Gladbeck hostage crisis had begun, and with each passing moment, the stakes grew higher. Among the hostages, a tapestry of ordinary lives now intertwined by terror, was Ingrid, a young bank teller working her way through university. Her hands, normally nimble as she counted out bills, now trembled uncontrollably. Beside her, huddled with his wife, was Helmut, a retired factory worker, his weathered face a mask of shock. Their carefully planned day trip to buy their granddaughter a birthday present had been shattered, replaced by the cold reality of their mortality. There was Marion, a single mother on her lunch break, her purse containing the rent money clutched tightly to her chest. Her thoughts raced to her two young children, their smiling faces a painful reminder of what she stood to lose. And there was Thomas, a young apprentice mechanic, his dreams of opening his own garage now seeming impossibly distant. Each hostage, bound by fear and circumstance, clung to the hope of survival, their individual stories merging into a collective narrative of terror. As the hours ticked by, the atmosphere inside the bank grew thick with despair. The initial shock was giving way to a chilling realization: their lives were no longer their own. They were at the mercy of two desperate men, their every action dictated by the whims of their captors. The weight of their situation pressed down on them, heavy and suffocating. Outside, the crowd of onlookers swelled, a morbid curiosity drawing them to the scene. Among them were concerned citizens, their faces etched with worry, and hardened reporters, their notebooks at the ready, eager to document every twist and turn of the unfolding drama. The Gladbeck hostage crisis had become a spectacle, a macabre drama played out on the streets of a once peaceful city. After hours of tense negotiations, punctuated by Rosner's increasingly erratic demands and threats, a deal was struck. In exchange for the release of some of the hostages, the authorities agreed to provide the two gunmen with a getaway car, a beige Opel Ascona. Their destination, Bremen, a port city over 300 kilometers to the north. The image of the Opel Ascona, its windows blacked out, speeding away from the bank with Rosner and Degowski inside, hostages visible in the back seat, became a defining image of the crisis. It was a chilling reminder of the powerlessness of the authorities, their inability to contain the situation and bring it to a peaceful resolution. As the Opel Ascona, pursued by a convoy of police cars, sped towards the outskirts of Gladbeck, it carried with it not just the hostages, but also the hopes and fears of a nation. The eyes of Germany were glued to their television screens, their hearts pounding in unison with the rhythm of the chase. The Gladbeck hostage crisis was no longer confined to the walls of a bank. It had spilled out onto the open road, its trajectory uncertain, its destination unknown. The journey to Bremen would be a harrowing one, a macabre road trip punctuated by moments of sheer terror and punctuated by the constant presence of the media, their cameras capturing every twist and turn of the unfolding drama. The Gladbeck hostage crisis was about to enter a new, even more dangerous phase. The Opel Ascona, carrying its cargo of fear and desperation, sped north, leaving Gladbeck behind in a cloud of dust and exhaust fumes. The streets, so recently teeming with police and onlookers, fell silent, the only sound the echo of sirens fading in the distance. A sense of unease lingered in the air, a palpable tension hanging over the city like a shroud. Inside homes and shops, people huddled around television sets, their faces illuminated by the flickering blue light, their eyes glued to the unfolding drama. The news, broadcast live from helicopters tracking the Opel Ascona's every move, became a constant soundtrack, the reporters' voices a mixture of urgency and disbelief. The Gladbeck hostage crisis had captivated the nation, its grip tightening with each passing kilometer. The police, frustrated by their inability to bring the situation to a swift resolution, found themselves in uncharted territory. The hostage-takers, emboldened by their success in escaping Gladbeck, seemed to be calling the shots, their demands becoming increasingly erratic, their actions increasingly unpredictable. The authorities, desperate to avoid further bloodshed, were forced to react, to follow the trail of the Opel Ascona as it carved a path of fear across the country. The journey to Bremen, however, was far from over. It would become a macabre odyssey, a testament to the desperation of the hostage-takers and the growing influence of the media, its presence both a blessing and a curse. The eyes of Germany, and indeed the world, were now fixed on the Opel Ascona and its occupants, their fates intertwined in a deadly game of cat and mouse. As the Opel Ascona sped towards Bremen, it became a magnet for the media. News vans, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, joined the pursuit, their cameras hungry for images, their microphones thrust towards anyone willing to offer an opinion, a theory, a prayer. The line between news reporting and entertainment blurred. The Gladbeck hostage crisis transformed into a real-life drama, broadcast live into living rooms across the nation. Reporters, eager for a scoop, abandoned journalistic ethics, their desire for a front-page story overriding any sense of responsibility. They interviewed the hostage takers, their voices amplified by loudspeakers, their faces beamed across the airwaves. They gave a platform to Rosner and Degowski, allowing them to voice their grievances, their threats, their demands. The constant media attention, far from deterring the hostage takers, seemed to embolden them, fueling their sense of importance, their belief that they were now in control. They played to the cameras, their actions becoming increasingly theatrical, their demands increasingly bizarre. The Gladbeck hostage crisis, once a local news story, had become a national obsession, a media spectacle that seemed to be spiraling out of control. The police, caught between their duty to protect the hostages and the overwhelming presence of the media, found themselves in an impossible situation. Every move they made, every decision they took, was scrutinized, analyzed, and broadcast to the nation. The media, initially a bystander, had become an active participant in the crisis, its influence growing with each passing hour. On a quiet stretch of Autobahn outside the town of Osnabrück, the Opel Ascona came to a halt. The hostage takers, their nerves frayed by the constant pursuit, needed fuel. It was a moment of opportunity for the police, a chance to end the ordeal peacefully. But the media presence, a chaotic scrum of cameras and reporters, complicated matters, turning a tense standoff into a potential bloodbath. As the hostage takers, their faces hidden behind ski masks, emerged from the car, their weapons drawn, the media surged forward, their cameras clicking, their microphones capturing every word, every threat. The police, their guns trained on the hostage takers, found their movements restricted, their options limited by the presence of the reporters and cameramen who had become unwilling participants in the drama. It was in this chaotic environment, with tensions running high and the media encroaching ever closer, that a fatal mistake was made. A shot rang out, echoing across the Autobahn, its trajectory uncertain, its target unknown. In the ensuing confusion, panic spread like wildfire. The hostage takers, their nerves shattered, reacted instinctively, their fingers tightening on their triggers. The police, caught in the crossfire, returned fire, their bullets aimed at the hostage takers. But with the hostages caught in the middle, the risk of innocent blood being spilled was horrifyingly real. The air, heavy with the smell of cordite and fear, crackled with tension. The initial burst of gunfire was followed by an eerie silence, broken only by the whirring of helicopter blades overhead and the distant wail of approaching sirens. The scene at the fuel stop, once a hive of activity, was now frozen in time, a tableau of chaos and despair. As the dust settled, the true horror of the situation became apparent. The ground around the Opel Ascona was stained crimson, the car itself riddled with bullet holes. The hostages, their faces pale with terror, were ushered away from the carnage, their ordeal far from over. But for one of their number, there would be no escape from the nightmare. Ingrid, the young bank teller, lay slumped in the back seat of the Opel Ascona, her lifeblood seeping onto the upholstery. A stray bullet fired in the heat of the moment had found its mark, cutting short a life full of promise. Her death, a senseless tragedy, marked a turning point in the Gladbeck hostage crisis, a descent into a maelstrom of violence and despair from which there would be no turning back. The Gladbeck hostage crisis, once a story of desperation and misguided ambition, had claimed its first victim, an innocent caught in the crossfire. The nation, glued to their television screens, watched in horror as the events unfolded, the hope that had flickered so briefly extinguished by the cold reality of death. The drama was far from over, but the path ahead was now shrouded in darkness. The Opel Ascona, now a hearse carrying the living and the dead, continued its northward journey. Inside, Rosner and Degowski, their eyes wild, their nerves shot, reacted with a chilling mix of bravado and desperation. Ingrid's lifeless body remained, a grim reminder of the stakes. They were no longer simply bank robbers, they were murderers, their hands stained with innocent blood. Bremen, once a beacon of hope, a potential escape route, now loomed large, a city bracing itself for the arrival of a storm. The news of the shooting at the fuel stop had spread like wildfire, transforming the Gladbeck hostage crisis from a national news story into an international incident. The world was watching, holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The police, their resources stretched thin, their every move shadowed by the ever-present media, faced a seemingly insurmountable task. How do you negotiate with desperate men who have nothing left to lose? How do you ensure the safety of the remaining hostages while apprehending armed and dangerous criminals? There were no easy answers, no tried and tested protocols for this kind of situation. As the Opel Ascona approached Bremen, the city seemed to hold its breath. The streets, usually bustling with life, were eerily deserted. The shops shuttered, the air thick with anticipation and dread. The Gladbeck hostage crisis, a whirlwind of chaos and violence, was about to make its mark on this historic port city. The Opel Ascona, its arrival heralded by a cacophony of sirens and the whirring of helicopter blades, rolled to a stop in the heart of Bremen, a city now transformed into a stage for a macabre spectacle. The eyes of the world, through the lenses of countless cameras, were focused on this one spot, this microcosm of terror and despair. Rosner and Degowski, their faces now familiar to millions, emerged from the car, their movements erratic, their eyes darting nervously from side to side. They were trapped, surrounded by a ring of steel, but they seemed determined to play out their roles to the bitter end. The media, sensing a climax to the drama, pressed forward, their cameras clicking, their microphones capturing every word, every gesture, every flicker of emotion. They had become both observers and participants, their presence both a comfort and a curse, a double-edged sword in a situation where every action, every decision, could have life or death consequences. The police, their faces grim, their fingers hovering near their triggers, maintained a tense perimeter, their every move dictated by the unpredictable actions of the hostage-takers. In a desperate bid to escape the tightening net, Rosner and Degowski forced their hostages into a nearby pharmacy, a nondescript building on a busy shopping street, now transformed into a fortress of fear. The world watched, horrified, as the hostages, their faces etched with exhaustion and terror, disappeared into the building, their fate uncertain. Inside the pharmacy, the air thick with the smell of medicine and fear, the hostages found themselves trapped in a surreal nightmare. The shelves, usually stocked with remedies for minor ailments, now seemed to mock their predicament. The mundane had been replaced by the unthinkable, the ordinary by the extraordinary. Rosner and Degowski, their bravado fading with each passing hour, paced the aisles like caged animals, their eyes wild, their voices laced with desperation. They issued demands, made threats, their words a confusing mix of braggadocio and despair. They were running out of time, running out of options, running out of hope. The police, their every move scrutinized by the media, faced an agonizing dilemma. How do you storm a building filled with innocent hostages and armed criminals without risking a bloodbath? How do you maintain control of a situation that seems to be spiraling ever further out of control? As the hours turned into an agonizing eternity, the atmosphere inside the pharmacy grew increasingly tense. The hostages, their resilience tested to the limit, clung to each other for support, their eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and defiance. They were pawns in a deadly game, their lives hanging precariously in the balance. Outside, the police, their patience wearing thin, their options dwindling, prepared for the inevitable. The decision to storm the pharmacy, a last resort fraught with risk, was one that no one wanted to make, but the safety of the hostages was paramount. The media, their cameras trained on the building, their microphones capturing every whispered word, every rumor, every speculation, documented the unfolding drama with an intensity that bordered on the voyeuristic. The Gladbeck hostage crisis, once a distant news story, had become a national obsession, a shared experience that transcended geography and social class. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the city, the walls were closing in on Rosner and Degowski. Their moment of notoriety, their brief taste of power, was coming to an end. The Gladbeck hostage crisis, a tragedy that had gripped the nation for days, was hurtling towards its climax, and the world watched, with a mixture of fascination and dread, waiting to see how the final act would play out. Inside the pharmacy, an unsettling silence had descended. The hostages, huddled together like frightened animals, dared not speak. Every rustle of clothing, every muffled sob seemed to amplify the tension in the air. Rosner and Degowski, their initial bravado replaced by a haunted look, paced the aisles, their shadows stretching and contorting in the flickering fluorescent light. The air was thick with the smell of stale pharmaceuticals and sweat. Outside, the incessant drone of a police helicopter served as a constant reminder of their predicament. Bremen, once a symbol of freedom and escape, now felt like a cage. The hostages clung to the hope of survival, their minds replaying fragments of their lives, their loved ones' faces a painful reminder of what was at stake. Degowski, his nerves stretched thin, chain-smoked, his eyes darting towards the pharmacy entrance with every shadow that crossed the doorway. Rosner, in a desperate attempt to assert control, barked orders at the hostages, his voice a strained whisper that did little to mask his growing fear. The police negotiators, their voices a calming presence in the tense silence, continued their efforts to establish communication. Every word, carefully chosen, was aimed at de-escalating the situation, at keeping Rosner and Degowski talking, at buying precious time for the hostages trapped inside. The stalemate, a fragile truce in a war of nerves, couldn't last forever. With each passing hour, the pressure mounted. The weight of their crimes, the realization that their escapade was doomed to fail, gnawed at the edges of Rosner's sanity. He became increasingly erratic, his demands bordering on the delusional. In a last-ditch attempt to regain control, to break free from the tightening noose, Rosner hatched a desperate plan. He demanded another getaway car, a white BMW this time, its engine running, waiting at the curb. The police, desperate to avoid further bloodshed, agreed. It was a gamble, a calculated risk to save lives. As the white BMW screeched away from the pharmacy, Rosner and Degowski, their hostages in tow, believed for a fleeting moment that they had outsmarted the authorities, but their freedom was short-lived. The police, their patience exhausted, their resolve hardened, were no longer willing to play by Rosner's rules. The chase, a high-speed ballet of screeching tires and flashing lights, played out on the streets of Bremen, a city now transformed into a battleground. The media, their cameras capturing every twist and turn, every near miss, every surge of adrenaline, followed closely behind, their presence a constant reminder that the world was watching. Rosner and Degowski, high on their own distorted sense of power, reveled in the chaos they had unleashed. They were no longer simply criminals, they were performers, their every action a spectacle designed to shock and amaze. But their bravado, their desperate attempts to control the narrative, masked a fatal flaw. They were dilettantes playing a deadly game. Their plan, hastily conceived and poorly executed, began to unravel as quickly as it had begun. The police, their tactics now aggressive, their movements precise, were closing in. The net was tightening, the escape route shrinking with every passing kilometer. The endgame, when it came, was swift and brutal. The white BMW, boxed in by a cordon of police cars, screeched to a halt on a deserted stretch of Autobahn. The media, their cameras rolling, their microphones capturing every sound, every shout, every gunshot, documented the final act of the tragedy. The Gladbeck hostage crisis, a story that had captivated a nation, was about to reach its bloody conclusion. The white BMW, its once pristine paintwork now marred by dust and the grime of the road, sat stranded under the harsh glare of police spotlights. The air, heavy with the smell of exhaust fumes and tension, crackled with the anticipation of the final act. Inside the vehicle, Rosner and Degowski, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes betraying the fear that their bravado could no longer conceal, had reached the end of the road. The negotiators' pleas, once a beacon of hope in the darkness, now fell on deaf ears. Rosner, his mind teetering on the precipice of madness, his grip on reality loosening with every passing moment, lashed out, his words a torrent of rage and despair. Degowski, his face a mask of defeat, seemed resigned to his fate, his hand trembling as he clutched his weapon. The police, their patience exhausted, their every instinct screaming for a swift resolution, prepared to storm the vehicle. The order to move when it came was sharp, precise, a finality that echoed in the stillness of the night. The sound of shattering glass, the staccato burst of gunfire, ripped through the tense silence, a violent punctuation mark to a drama that had held a nation captive. When the dust settled, the silence that descended was heavier than before, pregnant with the weight of tragedy. Rosner, his body riddled with bullets, slumped over the steering wheel, his reign of terror brought to an abrupt and bloody end. Degowski, wounded but alive, surrendered, his eyes vacant, his spirit broken. The hostages, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and horror, were freed from the car, their ordeal finally over. The Gladbeck hostage crisis, a tragedy that unfolded over 54 agonizing hours, had reached its conclusion. But the scars it left on the German psyche ran deep, a stark reminder of the fragility of peace, the vulnerability of innocence, and the devastating consequences of unchecked desperation. The nation, once captivated by the drama, now struggled to come to terms with the human cost. Ingrid, the young bank teller, her life tragically cut short, became a symbol of the innocent victims, forever linked to a tragedy they never deserved. The media, once eager participants in the spectacle, now faced a wave of criticism. Their role in the crisis questioned, their ethics scrutinized. The police, hailed as heroes for their bravery in the face of danger, also faced scrutiny. Their handling of the crisis, their decisions made under immense pressure, were dissected and debated, their actions analyzed for lessons learned, for ways to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. The Gladbeck hostage crisis was a watershed moment, a turning point in German history. It led to a reassessment of police tactics, a reevaluation of media responsibility, and a national conversation about the root causes of crime and the societal pressures that can lead individuals down a path of destruction. The events of those 54 hours in August 1988 serve as a stark reminder that even in the heart of Europe, chaos can erupt, shattering the illusion of peace and security. The Gladbeck hostage crisis, a story of desperation, violence, and the enduring power of the human spirit, continues to resonate today, a cautionary tale etched in the collective memory of a nation forever changed.